Becoming a writer was like having a counter identity. If you live in a place and a time where to other people you're a sort of packy, you're an immigrant, you're a generic disturber of the white homogenous environment, then deciding you're a writer is like a form of assertion. Actually, I'm not just a packy on the street who you can spit on, I'm a writer. I remember thinking when I was writing in my teens, thinking when I was writing those stories that I want people to know what it's like when people gob on you and call you a packy. You know, I want them to know what it's like so that, you know, that this is, writing a novel is a source of information about what it's like to be in Britain today. And that was one of my functions. I felt, you know, I had a place to speak, to say these things. I think the period that I've lived through since the 1950s is absolutely fascinating. I mean, when I was a kid, it was white Britain, and now it's you're lucky or indeed unlucky if you find a white person.
I guess there weren't that many role models for you when you were growing up, in terms of people who were from your background and your heritage, who were writers.
That's absolutely true. In those days, there were no real Indian writers who were at the centre of the British literary scene. There were obviously writers like Narayan and so on, who were, you know, proper writers and so on, but they weren't Forster. The only writer, I guess, who was significant and important was Naipaul, who had come a long way and achieved a lot. But as you say, otherwise there wasn't much going on. Now, as you know, all the writers are Indian. You have to be Indian to be a writer at all. But it wasn't really until, I guess, My Beautiful Laundrette, and probably more importantly, the most important thing was Midnight's Children, when the door finally opened to globalization of writing.
When did you first decide that you wanted to be a writer?
I knew I wanted to be a writer when I was 14. And I remember being at school, looking out the window, bored out of my mind in English, and this occurred to me. And then I suddenly felt very, very excited for once about the future and what I might do and who I might be. I thought, this is exactly what I want to do. And also, this was the 60s, when you were either going to stay in the suburbs and be a clerk, you know, that's what we were supposed to be.
Like your dad?
Like my dad. We'd work in insurance companies. That was a big deal if you were from the suburbs. Or you became a footballer, or a pop star, you know. And I couldn't do either of those things. So writing seemed to me to be a way through the middle, a way out of the suburbs.
And what did a writer's life look like in your head?
Well, basically you didn't have to go to work. I don't know about your dad, but my dad used to go to work every day, and it was a real pain in the arse that he had to go every single day. You know, it seemed amazing he had to go every day. He had to get up at, you know, 6 in the morning and get his suit on, and he came home really late, exhausted. And everybody in my neighbourhood did that. That was what work was for us. And so being an artist, being a writer, was like playing, was like mucking around.
Your dad was an aspiring writer.
My dad wanted to be a writer. He wrote books all the time. He sat in his room. He always wanted to be a writer, and he never really got very far with the writing. But he showed me that there was such a thing as discipline and persistence. And he showed me that language and literature and stories were important. And when I look at my kids, compared to them, I read all the time. I mean, when I was a teenager, I could see now, you know, big books, important books. Literature meant a lot to me.
Your emergence was at a time when some of the subjects that you were inevitably going to be drawn into, just by the fact of who you were becoming more and more relevant, and they were finding their moment as well.
They were relevant and they were finding their moment, but it was still quite difficult because people would say to you, they would still say to you, at the end of the 70s, even through the early 80s, they would say to you, why do you want to write about Pakistanis? Why do you want to write about someone in a corner shop? Why can't you write about white people? Why can't you write about English people? And you thought, these stories haven't been told yet. No one's written a proper story about an immigrant like my dad and what it's like to come to Britain. And you get off the boat at Southampton with your suitcase and so on. And I remember being very influenced particularly by films like The Godfather, for instance, which told the story of immigrants in America. And it was an epic story of numerous generations. And I remember thinking, well, that's the model. If we could do that, you know, explain the relationship between India and Britain and the men and women that have come out of that history. It seemed to me that I was, you know, cooking with a gas. This was fantastic material, and nobody really had dealt with it. But it was a struggle. People didn't really want it. You had to tell them they needed it.
And you started out in theatre.
I started working in the theatre because I liked working with other people. And when I went to the Royal Court, when I was 18, it was the first time really I had any proper education. I was with, white upper-class people who were well-educated and really bossy. And they were terrifying, but they really taught me a lot about writing, about literature, about how you organise your work, about creating character, about dialogue and so on. You've got to find the right place. You need to be with other people who are trying to do what you're doing so that you feel you're not completely isolated.
How did your dad take to your success?
Dad was rather shocked, I think. He was rather surprised, actually, because I think he thought that I was writing about things that were a bit daft, writing about velvet trousers and music and parties and the stuff of the 60s that was going on. I think he thought that you couldn't really put that stuff in books. Books were like Chekhov and Tolstoy, and proper, characters and lives and wars and stuff in. And my dad wanted to write books like that. So I was rather pleased that he thought my stuff was a bit daft because it didn't humiliate him. And it was a struggle indeed for me to try and, I think it is for all writers, to put your material into a book, into something that might be called literature. How do you combine that, being a Pakistani kid wearing velvet trousers, going to parties, taking drugs, the 60s, immigration? How do you find a shape and form for that? So it sort of took me ages to write the Borough of Suburbia, but that was the book that I was always about to go and write, I think.
And was there a sense of envy?
From Dad? Yeah, I think he sort of envied me, and I think he saw that the kind of success I was having before he died. He died after Sammy and Rosie, around that time, I think, before the Black Album. I think that was something that he wanted for himself.
The kids that you've got, I guess they're living in a very different London to the one that you grew up in. Do you envy them, or do you mourn the fact that they've got less to kick against?
They can do whatever they want most of the time. Their lives are incredibly privileged. But you might say it's also regrettable they didn't have a sense of, say, what racism is like. What those marches through South London by the NF actually were like, and how terrifying that was and what that meant. You can tell kids about that stuff, but if you haven't seen, a bunch of skinheads descending on you, screaming hate, you don't get a sense of what it might be like at other times and places to be frightened to be a minority.
So the idea of a collected short stories, it sounds a bit like a sort of a lifetime achievement award at the Brits or something, that it's just one step before you kick the bucket.
I was rather horrified when Faber suggested I do a collected stories, because as you say, it's like a tombstone. You think it's over, and when I saw the book, how big it was, I showed it to my family, who seemed rather impressed that I hadn't completely wasted my time, contrary to their ideas about me. It made me want to write more. I wanted to get on and do some new stuff. But I was pleased that all the bits and pieces, all the stories are together in one place.
If someone had shown the 14-year-old you a copy of collected short stories with your name on it, what do you think you'd have made of it?
I'd have been really pleased in terms of the discipline of, getting on with being a writer and doing it seriously for a long time. It seems to me that that's very difficult. I mean, most people can write 1, 2, 3, 4 books, but making a living out of it for a long time seems to me to be quite a difficult thing to do, and I'm more worried about other writers than I am about myself in the future. Whether writing may become like music, in the sense that people expect to download it for free all the time. And I wonder how, new young 14-year-old writers are going to make a living in the future, and that bothers me more than anything else.
You mentioned Freud, and I think I've read that you have therapy something like 3 times a week?
No, I don't need it. I don't go 3 times a week. I'm not that crazy, Sarfraz. Just twice a week, mate.
Hanif Qureshi, thank you very much.